In the heart of Manhattan, where glass towers pierce the clouds and fortunes are made before breakfast, there lived a boy who had everything money could buy. Everything except the one thing he wanted most. Caleb Harrison was born into a world of unimaginable privilege. His father, Richard Harrison, was a real estate mogul whose name appeared on buildings across 3 continents. The Harrison penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of one of the city's most exclusive buildings, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, priceless art on every wall. But for 10-year-old Caleb, this palace was a prison of silence. He was born profoundly deaf. Not a whisper, not a melody, not even the sound of his own voice reached him. The world existed behind an invisible wall of silence that no amount of money could break through. Richard had tried everything. The best specialists from Johns Hopkins Mayo Clinic, surgeons from Switzerland and Germany, experimental treatments that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, cutting-edge hearing aids, cochlear implant consultations, stem cell therapies still in clinical trials. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close. And so Caleb lived in his silent tower, watching the world move around him, but never quite being part of it. He communicated through a tablet, typing messages to tutors who treated him like he was fragile. He watched other children in the park below playing games he could never fully join, laughing at jokes he would never hear. His father meant well. Richard provided the best education money could buy, the finest clothes, every toy and gadget imaginable. But there was something missing between them, some connection that couldn't form across the barrier of silence. Richard didn't know sign language. He was always too busy, always rushing to another meeting, another deal, another city. They lived in the same home, but existed in different worlds. Caleb spent his days drawing. He filled sketchbook after sketchbook with images of things he'd never experienced. He drew musicians playing instruments, their faces alive with emotion. He drew concert halls filled with people moved to tears. He drew sound waves, trying to imagine what they might look like if he could see them. In one drawing, he'd sketched himself standing in front of a piano, his hands on the keys, with waves of color radiating outward. His art therapist had asked him what it meant. He'd typed on his tablet, "I want to know what music feels like." The therapist had looked at the drawing for a long time, then simply said, "That's beautiful, Caleb." But beautiful wasn't enough. Caleb didn't want sympathy. He didn't want understanding. He wanted to hear. The doctors had told Richard there was no hope. The damage to Caleb's auditory nerves was complete. Even the most advanced technology couldn't help. They would have to accept it and focus on giving Caleb the best life possible within his limitations. Richard had accepted their verdict because men of science had spoken, and science didn't lie. But science didn't know about Grace Thompson. On a cold November morning when frost painted patterns on the penthouse windows and Caleb sat by the glass watching pigeons, he couldn't hear a woman walked through the Harrisons' front door who would change everything. She carried with her a secret that had been born from tragedy, a gift wrapped in grief, and a truth that millionaires and doctors had never discovered. Her name was Grace, and she was about to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions come from the most unexpected places. Grace Thompson was not what Richard Harrison expected when the employment agency sent her profile. She was 52 years old, with gray threading through her short, natural hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. Her resume was modest. 20 years of domestic work for various families in Queens and Brooklyn, high school diploma. References that called her reliable, trustworthy kind. Nothing exceptional. Nothing that would make her stand out among the dozen other candidates. But Richard was desperate. It had been 3 months since the last housekeeper quit. The previous woman had lasted only 6 weeks before she handed in her resignation, saying she couldn't handle the atmosphere in the apartment. Too quiet, she'd said. Too sad. She felt like she was working in a museum, not a home. Richard had been offended at the time. Now alone in his pristine penthouse with a son who barely looked at him anymore, he wondered if she'd been right. So when Grace arrived for her interview on that November morning, Richard was prepared to hire almost anyone who seemed competent. He met her in the living room, where morning light streamed through windows that cost more to clean than most people earned in a month. Grace sat on the edge of a white leather sofa that probably cost more than her car, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Richard went through the standard questions. Hours, duties, expectations. Grace answered each one with quiet confidence, her voice warm and measured. Then Richard mentioned Caleb. "My son is deaf," he said, watching her reaction carefully. This was where most candidates faltered. Some looked uncomfortable, others overly sympathetic. A few had admitted they didn't know sign language and weren't sure they could communicate with him. Grace simply nodded. "How old is he, 10? He was born profoundly deaf. He uses a tablet to communicate, mostly. Some basic signs, but we don't. I don't know ASL very well." Something flickered in Grace's eyes. Not pity, not discomfort. Something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "I see," she said quietly. Richard continued, a little defensive now. "He's a good kid. Quiet, obviously. He keeps to himself mostly. His tutor comes in the mornings. He draws a lot. You wouldn't have to do much with him, just general housekeeping and meal preparation." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Does he like music?" The question caught Richard off guard. "Music? He can't hear it. I didn't ask if he could hear it. I asked if he likes it." Richard blinked. He thought about Caleb's drawings, all those sketches of instruments and concert halls and invisible sound waves. He draws pictures of it, musicians' instruments. "I think he's curious about it, but obviously, Grace repeated, but her tone suggested she didn't find anything obvious about it at all. There was something in her demeanor that Richard couldn't quite place. A stillness, yes, but not the nervousness he usually saw in interviews. Grace carried herself with a kind of quiet authority that seemed at odds with her modest resume. "Do you have children, Ms. Thompson?" he asked. The question hung in the air for just a beat too long. Grace's hands resting in her lap tightened almost imperceptibly. "I had a son," she said finally. "He passed away 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Richard said automatically, suddenly feeling like he'd stepped on something fragile. Grace nodded, accepting his condolence with dignity. He was 27. His name was Joshua. She didn't offer more, and Richard didn't press. He understood grief. His own wife had died when Caleb was 2, a brain aneurysm that struck without warning. One moment she was laughing at breakfast, the next she was gone. He'd learned that some losses created spaces in your soul that never quite filled in again. "The position is yours if you want it," Richard heard himself say. "When can you start?" Grace looked at him for a long moment, and Richard had the strange feeling she was evaluating him as much as he'd been evaluating her. "Tomorrow," she said. "I can start tomorrow." They shook hands, and as Grace's warm palm pressed against his, Richard felt an unexpected sense of relief. He didn't know why. On paper, Grace Thompson was just another housekeeper, no different from the others who'd come and gone. But there was something about her, a presence, a knowing. As she stood to leave, Grace paused at the doorway. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "your son, the drawings of music. Do you keep them? They're all over his room. dozens of sketchbooks full. Grace nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd been wondering about. That's good. That means hope isn't lost. Richard frowned. Hope for what? But Grace just smiled a sad and beautiful smile that seemed to carry years of secrets. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Harrison. And then she was gone, leaving Richard standing in his marble entryway, wondering what exactly he'd just hired. That night, after he'd tucked Caleb into bed, and the boy had signed goodnight without meeting his eyes, Richard stood in the hallway outside his son's room. Through the cracked door, he could see Caleb's walls covered with those drawings, pianos and violins and drums, singers with their mouths open wide, musical notes floating through the air like birds, a child's desperate attempt to understand something he'd never experienced. For the first time in years, Richard felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the shadow of hope's possibility. Tomorrow, Grace Thompson would walk through their door again, and nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, Grace arrived at exactly 7 o'clock as the first light of dawn painted the city gold. Richard was already awake, as he always was. Sleep had become difficult over the years, his mind constantly churning through deals and problems, and the persistent ache of failing his son despite every resource at his disposal. He'd made coffee, and was standing at the window when Grace let herself in with the key he'd messengered to her the previous evening. She wore simple clothes, dark slacks, and a blue cardigan, her hair pulled back neatly. She carried a large canvas bag over her shoulder. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said. "Richard, please." He gestured to the coffee maker. "Help yourself." Caleb usually wakes around 8. His tutor arrives at 9. Grace nodded, setting her bag down carefully by the door. Richard noticed she handled it gently, as if it contained something precious. "Before I start the housekeeping," Grace said, "would it be all right if I introduced myself to Caleb? I find it's better when children know who I am from the beginning." Richard hesitated. Caleb didn't do well with strangers. New people made him anxious. They stared too long or spoke too loud, forgetting he couldn't hear them, or worse, they talked about him like he wasn't there. But something in Grace's calm assurance made him nod. "I'll take you to his room." They walked down the long hallway past photographs of Richard receiving business awards and shaking hands with politicians. There were a few pictures of Caleb as a baby held by his mother, who smiled at the camera with no idea she had only months left to live. Richard knocked on Caleb's door, then opened it slowly. The boy was already awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed, with a sketchbook open in his lap. He looked up when they entered, and Richard saw the familiar flash of wariness in his son's dark eyes. Richard signed "Good morning," one of the few phrases he knew. Caleb signed back automatically, then noticed Grace standing behind his father. "Caleb," Richard said, forgetting again that speaking was useless. He pulled out his phone, typing quickly. He held it up so Caleb could read the screen. "This is Grace. She's our new housekeeper. She wants to meet you." Caleb looked at Grace with the careful, measuring gaze he'd developed over the years. Grace stepped forward, and to Richard's surprise, her hands moved in fluid, practiced signs. "Good morning, Caleb. My name is Grace. It's nice to meet you." Caleb's eyes widened. He glanced at his father, then back at Grace. Slowly, hesitantly, he signed back. "You know sign language?" Grace smiled. "Yes. I learned it a long time ago." She paused, then added, "I like your drawings. May I see?" For a moment, Richard thought Caleb would refuse. He was protective of his sketches, rarely showing them to anyone. But something in Grace's expression, open and genuinely interested without a trace of pity, seemed to reach him. Caleb held out the sketchbook. Grace took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and Caleb shifted to give her space. Richard stood in the doorway, feeling oddly like an intruder in his own son's room. Grace turned the pages, slowly studying each drawing with real attention. Caleb had been working on a series of sketches showing a grand piano from different angles. In one, the lid was open, and he'd drawn the strings inside with meticulous detail. In another, hands hovered over the keys, caught mid-motion. Grace stopped at that particular drawing, her finger tracing the outline of the hands. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she signed, "These are beautiful. You have real talent." Caleb ducked his head shy with the compliment. He signed, "I've never seen a real piano, just pictures and videos." Grace looked up at Richard, still standing in the doorway. Then she turned back to Caleb. "Would you like to see a real piano?" Caleb's head snapped up, his expression caught between hope and confusion. He signed, "How I can't hear it." Grace's hands moved in response, careful and clear. Hearing isn't the only way to experience music. Richard felt something cold slide down his spine. He'd heard this before from therapists and well-meaning friends. They'd tried everything. Vibrating platforms, visual displays that translated sound into light patterns, even a ridiculous contraption that was supposed to let Caleb feel rhythms through his bones. Nothing had worked. Nothing had given Caleb what he truly wanted. But Grace didn't know that yet. She would learn, as everyone else had learned, that some problems couldn't be solved, even by people with the best intentions. Caleb was signing to Grace, excited now, his hands moving quickly. Richard caught fragments of the conversation. Music. Feel. How. Piano. Possible. Grace answered each question with patience, her signs clear and unhurried. She pointed to Caleb's drawings, then placed her hand flat on the bed, pressing down slightly, as if demonstrating something. Richard's phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. "Crisis with the Chicago project. Conference call in 20 minutes. "I have to take this," he said, then realized again that speaking was pointless. But Grace glanced at him and nodded understanding without words. Richard left them there. Grace and Caleb sitting on the bed with sketchbooks spread between them, their hands moving in silent conversation. As he walked back to his office, Richard felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it. Jealousy. His son was talking to a stranger he'd met 5 minutes ago, with more animation and openness than he'd shown Richard in months. A stranger who knew how to reach across the silence that Richard had never learned to bridge. He closed his office door and joined the conference call, letting the familiar rhythm of business problems wash over him. These he understood. These he could solve. But later, when the call ended and Richard emerged from his office, he found Grace in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Caleb sat at the counter, still in his pajamas, watching Grace work. His sketchbook was open in front of him, but he wasn't drawing. He was watching Grace with the kind of focused attention Richard hadn't seen in his son in years. Grace was making pancakes, her movements efficient and practiced. But there was something else she was doing. Every time she completed an action, cracking an egg, whisking the batter, pouring it onto the griddle, she would turn to Caleb, and her hands would move in signs. She was narrating what she was doing, teaching him the signs for cooking for food, for the small, ordinary moments that make up a life. And Caleb was absorbing every word, every gesture, like a plant that had been dying in darkness suddenly turned toward the sun. Richard stood in the doorway, watching this scene that should have been ordinary, but felt like something else entirely. Something important. Grace glanced up and saw him. She smiled, then signed something to Caleb. The boy looked over his shoulder, saw his father, and for once didn't look away immediately. Caleb signed, "Grace is teaching me new words." "That's good," Richard said uselessly. Grace held up a spatula, making eye contact with Richard. She signed as she spoke aloud so they could both understand. "Breakfast in 5 minutes. I hope you like blueberry pancakes." Richard realized it had been years since anyone had cooked breakfast in this kitchen. They usually ordered in or ate cereal. The smell of the pancakes, warm and sweet, filled the space with something that felt almost like home. "Thank you," he said. And in that moment, watching his son engaged and almost happy watching this woman he'd hired less than 24 hours ago, already changing the atmosphere of their cold penthouse. Richard Harrison felt the first real stirring of hope. He didn't know yet what Grace Thompson was planning. He didn't know about the canvas bag she'd brought, or the secret it contained, or the journey she was about to take them on. But something had shifted. The first crack had appeared in the wall of silence. And through that crack, something miraculous was beginning to seep in. Grace had not told Richard Harrison the whole truth about her son. She'd said Joshua died 3 years ago. She'd said his name. But she hadn't told the rest of the story, because the rest of the story was her deepest wound, the one that had never properly healed. That first week working in the Harrison penthouse, Grace moved through her duties with practiced efficiency. She cleaned rooms that were already spotless, organized closets that held more clothes than some department stores, prepared meals in a kitchen equipped with appliances that cost more than cars. But her real attention was always on Caleb. She watched him during his tutoring sessions, sitting quietly in a corner, supposedly dusting bookshelves, but actually observing how the boy struggled to focus on lessons that seemed to bore him. She watched him at lunch, eating mechanically, while scrolling through videos on his tablet, videos of musicians and concerts, watching with hungry eyes. She watched him in his afternoons when he drew hour after hour, trying to capture something he'd never experienced. And every time she watched him, Grace saw Joshua. On her 6th day working for the Harrisons, Richard had to fly to London for an emergency business meeting. He would be gone for 4 days. He'd apologized profusely, asked if Grace would mind staying late to make sure Caleb was all right, offered to pay her double. Grace had simply nodded and said, "Don't worry, we'll be fine." The night Richard left, after Caleb's tutor had gone home and dinner had been cleared away, Grace found the boy in the living room, standing at the massive windows that overlooked the city. Lights twinkled below like fallen stars. The world was out there, loud and bright and full of music Caleb would never hear. Grace approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. She touched his shoulder gently, and Caleb turned. She signed, "Are you okay?" Caleb shrugged, a gesture that needed no language. He looked back out the window. Grace stood beside him, looking out at the same view. Then she began to sign slowly and deliberately. "When I was young, I had a son. His name was Joshua." Caleb looked at her curiosity, replacing the sadness in his eyes. Grace continued, "Joshua was like you. He was born deaf, completely deaf." Caleb's hands moved quickly. What happened to him? Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the grief that lived there permanently like a second heartbeat. But she'd come this far. Caleb deserved to know. He died 3 years ago. He was 27. A car accident. Caleb's face crumpled with empathy. He signed, "I'm sorry." Grace nodded, accepting his sympathy. Then she continued. But before he died, something amazing happened. Joshua found a way to experience music. Caleb's eyes went wide. How Grace gestured to the sofa, and they both sat down. The city lights painted patterns across the floor, and in the quiet of the penthouse, Grace told Caleb the story she'd never told anyone else in its entirety. She signed as she spoke aloud, the words flowing in both languages simultaneously. Joshua was diagnosed as profoundly deaf when he was 2 years old, just like you. The doctors said the same things your doctors probably said. No cure, no hope, learn to adapt. I was a single mother working 2 jobs, barely keeping our heads above water. I couldn't afford the experimental treatments or the specialists. Joshua grew up in silence in a small apartment in Queens where the walls were thin and the neighbors complained about everything. He went to a school for deaf children, made friends, learned ASL. He was happy enough, I think. But there was always something missing. He would watch music videos with the sound off, studying the musicians' faces, trying to understand what made music so important to hearing people. When he was 16, something happened. His school took the students to the Museum of Natural History. There was an exhibit on sound and vibration. They had these displays where you could touch panels that vibrated at different frequencies. Joshua stood at one of them for almost an hour, just pressing his hands against it, feeling the different patterns. That night he came home and told me, "Mom, I felt music today." I didn't understand what he meant, but Joshua was determined to explain it. He took me to our old piano. Grace paused here, and Caleb leaned forward, completely absorbed. We had this beat-up upright piano in our apartment, Grace continued. It had belonged to my grandmother. I'd kept it even though no one played it anymore because I couldn't bear to get rid of it. Joshua sat down at that piano and just started pressing keys. Random at first, no pattern. But then, he started to notice something. Each key created a different vibration. He could feel them through the bench, through his hands on the keys, through his feet on the floor. And slowly, incredibly, Joshua began to understand that these different vibrations were notes, different frequencies, different feelings. He taught himself to play piano by feeling the vibrations, not by hearing, but by feeling. It took him 2 years of practicing every single day. 2 years of learning to recognize patterns, to understand which vibrations went together, which ones created harmony, which ones were discord. And then one day, he played me a song. An actual song with melody and rhythm and soul. He played it by feeling alone, and it was beautiful. Caleb's hands were trembling as he signed, "Did it make him happy?" Grace smiled, and tears slid down her cheeks. It gave him everything. Joshua discovered that through vibration, through the physical sensation of sound waves, he could access music in a way that was just as real as hearing it. Maybe more real, because he understood it in his body, in his bones. Music wasn't something distant or abstract to him. It was physical. It was touch. It was real. He started teaching other deaf children his technique. He developed a whole method vibration-based music therapy. He was going to publish a paper about it, maybe start a school. He had his whole life ahead of him, this beautiful purpose he'd found. And then one rainy Tuesday morning, a driver ran a red light, and Joshua was gone. The room was completely silent. Even the city sounds from below seemed muted, respectful of this grief. Caleb reached out and took Grace's hand. She held it tightly, this small hand of a boy she'd known for less than a week, but who already felt like a second chance at something precious. Finally, Caleb signed with his free hand. "Is that why you wanted to work here? Because of me?" Grace nodded. "When I saw your father's job posting, and he mentioned you were deaf, I thought maybe it was a sign. Maybe I could share what Joshua discovered. Maybe his work didn't have to die with him." "What was in your bag?" The first day Caleb signed. Grace's smile widened. "Would you like to see?" Caleb nodded eagerly. Grace stood and retrieved her canvas bag from where she'd left it in the corner of her room. She brought it back to the living room and sat down beside Caleb. Slowly, reverently, she pulled out what was inside. It was an old electronic keyboard, battered and worn with tape holding one corner together. The keys were yellowed with age, and there were stickers on it marking different notes. It had clearly been loved, used constantly, carried carefully through years of life. This was Joshua's grace, signed. This is what he learned on, what he played every day. Caleb stared at the keyboard like it was a sacred relic, which in a way it was. "Can I touch it?" he signed. "Of course." Caleb reached out tentatively and pressed a key. Of course, no sound came to him, but his eyes widened slightly. He pressed another key, then another. "I can feel it," he signed, wonder spreading across his face. "The vibration, it's different for each one." Grace nodded. "Yes, that's exactly what Joshua discovered. Every note has its own feeling, its own personality, and when you put them together..." She reached over and played a simple chord. Caleb's hand was resting on the side of the keyboard, and his whole body seemed to respond to the vibration that traveled through the instrument. "That's amazing," he signed. Grace looked at this boy so much like her son had been full of curiosity and longing and untapped potential. She made a decision then, one she'd been turning over in her mind since she first walked through the Harrisons' door. "Caleb," she signed, "would you like me to teach you what Joshua learned? Would you like to learn how to play music?" Caleb's response was immediate and emphatic. "Yes. Yes, please." But Grace held up a hand, making sure he understood. "It won't be easy. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of patience. And I need to ask your father's permission first." Caleb's expression fell slightly. "My dad won't believe it's possible." Grace considered this. "You might be right. But I think maybe it's time we showed him what's possible when you stop listening to doctors who say no and start believing in your own potential." When Caleb signed. "When can we start?" Grace smiled. "When your father gets back from London, we'll talk to him together. And then if he says yes, we'll start your first lesson." Caleb threw his arms around Grace in a sudden fierce hug. She held him tight. This child, who wasn't hers, but who carried her son's dream forward into the future. That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Grace sat in the dim living room with Joshua's keyboard on her lap. She played a few notes, feeling the familiar vibrations that had been such a part of her life when her son was alive. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty room. "Every day I miss you. But maybe this is why. Maybe this is what you were preparing me for." The keyboard hummed under her fingers, and somewhere in the vibrations, Grace felt like Joshua was answering. "Keep going, Mom. Show them what we learned. Show them that silence doesn't mean absence. Show them that music lives everywhere, even in the quiet." Grace wiped her tears and carefully packed the keyboard away. In 3 days, Richard Harrison would return from London. And then the real work would begin. Richard Harrison returned from London, exhausted, jet-lagged, and in a foul mood. The emergency that had called him across the Atlantic had turned out to be a manufactured crisis, a power play by board members who wanted to remind him who held the reins. He'd spent 4 days in tense meetings, sleeping poorly in a hotel room, eating meals he didn't taste, all while feeling like he should be home with Caleb. He arrived back at the penthouse on a gray Sunday afternoon, dragging his suitcase through the door, and immediately sensing that something was different. Music. No, not music. He could hear music playing from somewhere in the apartment, a soft melody drifting down the hallway. But that made no sense. Caleb couldn't hear music, and Grace wouldn't play music while working, would she? Richard set down his suitcase and followed the sound. It was coming from the living room. As he got closer, he could hear the distinctive sound of a piano, or rather a keyboard. The notes were simple, a basic scale being played slowly and deliberately. He reached the living room doorway and stopped dead. Caleb was sitting at the coffee table with an old electronic keyboard in front of him. Grace sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Caleb's small hands were on the keys, and he was playing. Actually playing, pressing one key after another in a careful progression. But it was the expression on his son's face that made Richard's breath catch. Caleb was completely focused, his eyes closed, his whole body leaning slightly forward. He looked peaceful, no more than peaceful. He looked connected, like he was part of something larger than himself. Grace glanced up and saw Richard in the doorway. She didn't seem startled. She simply smiled and held a finger to her lips, asking for silence. Richard watched as Grace's hand moved in signs too quick for him to follow. Caleb nodded and adjusted his hand position on the keys. He played the scale again, and this time there was something more confident about it, more intentional. When he finished, Grace signed something else. Caleb opened his eyes, and his face lit up with pure joy. That's when he noticed his father. The joy dimmed slightly, replaced by uncertainty. Caleb looked at Grace, then back at Richard. Richard stepped into the room, his mind racing with questions. "What's going on?" Grace stood gesturing for Richard to sit down. He did, sinking into an armchair across from his son. Grace began to sign, speaking aloud simultaneously so Richard could follow. "While you were gone, Caleb and I had a conversation. I told him about my son Joshua and how he learned to experience music through vibration. Caleb wanted to learn the same technique." Richard looked at the keyboard, then at Caleb, then back at Grace, but he can't hear it. Hearing isn't the only way to experience music, Grace said, and Richard realized she'd said almost the exact same thing the first time they met. Joshua proved that, and Caleb is proving it now. "I don't understand." Grace gestured to Caleb. "Show him." Caleb hesitated, then placed his hands on the keys. He played a simple melody, just a few notes. But there was a rhythm to it, a pattern. It wasn't random. "Now watch," Grace said softly. She reached over and played the same melody, but added something to it, a harmony underneath. Even to Richard's untrained ear, it sounded complete, whole. Then Grace signed to Caleb, and he played his part again while she played hers. They created a simple duet, both focused completely on their hands, on the keys, on the vibrations traveling through the instrument. When they finished, Caleb looked at his father with an expression that was half hope, half fear. Richard realized his mouth was hanging open. He closed it, trying to find words. He learned that in 4 days he managed. He learned the basics, Grace corrected. This is just the beginning. But yes, he's learning to recognize different vibrations, to understand that each note has its own feeling. With practice, with time, Caleb can learn to play music just like any other child. Maybe better, because he'll understand it in a way most people never will. Richard felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. For 10 years, he'd been told by experts, by specialists with prestigious degrees and published papers, that Caleb would never experience music, that it was impossible, that accepting this limitation was the healthiest thing they could do. And now, a housekeeper he'd hired less than 2 weeks ago was sitting in his living room telling him all those experts were wrong. How he asked, "How is this possible?" Grace sat down again, her hands moving as she explained. Sound is vibration. Music is organized vibration. When Caleb puts his hands on the keys, when he sits close to the speakers, when he touches the instrument, he feels those vibrations. His brain is incredibly adaptive. With practice, he can learn to interpret those physical sensations as music. Not the way you or I hear it, but in a way that's just as real, just as meaningful. But the doctors said, "The doctors were wrong," Grace said simply. Or rather, they were limited by their own understanding. They thought because Caleb couldn't hear the way most people hear, he couldn't experience music at all. They didn't consider other pathways, other ways of knowing. Richard looked at his son. Caleb was watching this conversation anxiously, clearly trying to read his father's reaction. "Is this what you want?" Richard asked him. To learn this, Caleb's hands moved so fast they almost blurred. "Yes, more than anything. Please." Richard felt something crack open in his chest, some hard shell he'd built around his heart to protect himself from disappointment. Here was his son asking for something, wanting something with a passion Richard hadn't seen in years. How could he say no? How could he be the one to dim that light in Caleb's eyes? "Okay," Richard said. "Okay, we'll try it." Caleb launched himself at his father, wrapping his arms around Richard's neck in a fierce hug. Richard held his son, feeling the boy's heart beating rapidly against his chest, and realized he couldn't remember the last time they'd embraced like this. When Caleb pulled back, he was grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. He turned to Grace and signed something rapidly. Grace laughed the first time Richard had heard her really laugh. "He says thank you and asks if we can practice every day." Every day, Richard agreed. That evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, clutching a book about music theory that Grace had given him, Richard found Grace in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Grace turned from the sink. "Of course. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? About your son and this method?" Grace was quiet for a moment, drying her hands on a towel. "Honestly, I wasn't sure you'd believe me. Most people don't. When I tell them my deaf son learned to play piano, they think I'm exaggerating or misunderstanding. They think he was just pressing keys randomly and I was seeing patterns that weren't there because I wanted to so badly." "Was he?" Richard asked. "Just pressing keys randomly?" Grace met his eyes steadily. Joshua composed his own music. He performed at a recital for other deaf students. He taught 12 other children his method, and 11 of them learned to play. He was going to change how we think about disability and music and what's possible. And then he died, and I thought maybe that dream died with him. Her voice wavered on the last words, and Richard saw the grief that still lived in her. "But then you met Caleb," he said softly. "But then I met Caleb," she agreed. "And I thought maybe I could give Joshua's gift to another child who needed it. Maybe that's why I lost him. So I could be here now for this moment for your son." Richard didn't know if he believed in that kind of cosmic arrangement, in loss being somehow purposeful. But looking at Grace's face, seeing the determination there mixed with the sorrow he found, he wanted to believe. "Thank you," he said, "for trying. Even if this doesn't work out exactly how we hope, thank you for giving him hope." Grace smiled. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, this is going to work out. I've seen it before. Caleb has something special. He has the same hunger Joshua had, the same determination. He's going to surprise us all." That night, Richard stood outside Caleb's room and watched his son sleep. The boy's hands were curled on the pillow, and his face was peaceful in a way Richard hadn't seen in months. On the nightstand beside the bed, Richard could see the book Grace had given Caleb. On top of it was a piece of paper, a new drawing. Richard stepped into the room quietly and picked up the drawing. It showed a boy sitting at a piano. The boy's hands were on the keys, and waves of color radiated out from the instrument, not just forward, but everywhere surrounding the boy in a cocoon of light. The boy's eyes were closed, but he was smiling. At the bottom of the page, in Caleb's careful handwriting, were 3 words, "I can feel." Richard set the drawing down carefully. his vision blurred with tears he didn't bother to hide. Something had started here, something that felt like the beginning of a miracle. And for the first time since his wife died, since the doctors told him his son would never hear, since he'd built an empire trying to prove that money could solve anything, Richard Harrison allowed himself to hope. Really, truly hope. 3 weeks passed, and Caleb's progress was remarkable. Every afternoon after his regular tutoring session ended, Grace and Caleb would spend 2 hours with the keyboard. She'd taught him to recognize 12 different notes by their vibrations. She'd shown him how patterns of vibrations created melodies. He was learning scales, simple chords, the basic building blocks of music. Richard watched these lessons when he could, standing in the doorway of the living room, marveling at the patience Grace showed and the fierce concentration on Caleb's face. His son was learning something that doctors had said was impossible, and he was doing it through sheer determination and Grace's guidance. The apartment felt different now, lighter somehow, despite the gray December weather outside. There was laughter more often. Grace had a quick wit and a gift for storytelling, and even though Richard couldn't always follow the sign language conversations she had with Caleb, he could see the joy in them. For those 3 weeks, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe things were finally turning around. And then everything fell apart. It started with a phone call at 6 in the morning, 2 days before Christmas. Richard answered groggily, expecting news from Tokyo, where his firm was closing a major deal. Instead, it was his lawyer, Michael, and his voice was tight with controlled panic. "Richard, we have a problem, a big one." Richard sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. What kind of problem? The Sterling Tower project. The foundation inspection came back. There are structural issues, serious ones. The building isn't safe. Richard's blood ran cold. Sterling Tower was his flagship project, a 70-story luxury building in downtown Manhattan that was 90% sold. People were scheduled to start moving in next month. He'd staked his reputation and nearly $1 billion on this building. "How serious?" he asked. "Serious enough that we need to halt occupancy. Probably serious enough that we need to evacuate the construction crews and do a full structural review. Richard, if this gets out before we have a solution, it's going to be catastrophic. We're talking lawsuits, bankruptcy, criminal negligence charges." The next 72 hours were a nightmare. Richard barely slept, barely ate. He spent 18 hours a day in emergency meetings with lawyers, engineers, city officials, and investors. The structural problems were worse than initially reported. The foundation had been compromised by an underground water source that hadn't been properly accounted for in the original survey. Fixing it would cost hundreds of millions. Might not even be possible. And the media had gotten wind of the story. By Christmas Eve, Richard's phone was ringing constantly with journalists asking for comment. His email was flooded with angry messages from buyers demanding their deposits back. 3 major investors had already pulled out, taking their money with them. Richard's business empire, built over 25 years, was crumbling. He came home Christmas Eve night at almost midnight, his tie loosened, his shirt. Wrinkled dark circles under his eyes. The penthouse was dark, except for the glow of the Christmas tree Grace had insisted on putting up. Grace was there waiting for him, a cup of tea already prepared. "You should be home," Richard said, his voice rough from hours of argument in boardrooms. "It's Christmas Eve." "I called my sister and told her I'd come by tomorrow," Grace said. "I didn't want Caleb to be alone tonight. He was asking about you." Guilt lanced through Richard. He'd barely seen Caleb in 3 days. The music lessons had been put on hold. Everything had been put on hold. "I'm sorry," Richard said, and he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Grace or to himself or to his son sleeping down the hall. Grace handed him the tea. "Drink this. You need to rest." "I can't rest." Do you know what's happening? I'm losing everything. The Sterling Tower project is going to take down my entire company. Every project, every property, everything I've built. It's all going to be gone." The words came out harsher than he intended, but he couldn't stop them. The pressure of the last 3 days had to go somewhere. Grace simply nodded. "I know. I've been reading the news. Then you understand. I'm going to lose everything. This apartment, the company, my reputation. I'll be lucky if I don't end up in prison." "You won't go to prison," Grace said calmly. "The engineering firm is at fault, not you. That doesn't matter. In the public eye, I'm the developer. My name is on the building. I'm responsible." Richard set down the tea, his hands shaking slightly. "I've failed at everything. My company, my son, my life. Everything." "You haven't failed, Caleb," Grace said quietly. Richard laughed, a bitter sound. "Haven't I? I've barely seen him in 3 days. I missed his music lesson yesterday. I missed Christmas Eve with him. What kind of father am I, the kind who's dealing with a crisis? Caleb understands. Does he? Or does he just think I'm like I've always been too busy for him?" Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why don't you ask him yourself? He's asleep." "Actually, he's not." Richard looked up sharply. Grace nodded toward the hallway. "He heard you come in." "Well, he felt the vibrations of the door closing. He came out of his room about 5 minutes before you got here. He's waiting in his room for you." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I don't know what to say to him." "Start with the truth," Grace said. "That's always a good place." Richard stood slowly, feeling every one of his 43 years. He walked down the hallway to Caleb's room and knocked softly, even though knocking was pointless. He opened the door. Caleb was sitting up in bed, the glow of his tablet illuminating his face. When he saw his father, he set the tablet aside. Richard crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Richard's hands moved clumsily through the signs Grace had been teaching him. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I haven't been here." Caleb's response was immediate. "It's okay. Grace told me you're dealing with work problems." Richard felt tears sting his eyes. Work problems. Such simple words for the collapse of everything he'd built. Big problems, Richard signed. Very big. Caleb hesitated, then signed, "Are we going to be okay?" Richard didn't know how to answer that. Honestly, he didn't know if they would be okay. But looking at his son's face, seeing the worry there mixed with trust, he couldn't bring himself to burden the boy with the full truth. "We'll figure it out," he signed. "We always do." But even as he made the signs, Richard felt the hollowness of the words. Because he didn't always figure it out. He'd failed to help his son's deafness. He'd failed to keep his wife alive. And now he was failing at the one thing he'd always been good at: business. Caleb reached out and took his father's hand. Richard looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred from years of work. Caleb's small and soft. Then Caleb started signing with his free hand. "Grace says that sometimes things have to fall apart, so new things can grow. Like when trees lose their leaves in winter. They look dead, but they're just resting. Getting ready for spring." Richard stared at his son. "Grace told you that?" Caleb nodded. "When tonight? When I was worried about you?" Richard felt something shift in his chest. Grace had been preparing Caleb for this conversation, helping him understand, giving him wisdom to offer his father. "You're right," Richard signed. "Sometimes things need to fall apart." He pulled Caleb into a hug, holding his son close. The boy's small arms wrapped around his neck, and Richard felt the steady beat of Caleb's heart against his chest. "I love you," Richard whispered, even though Caleb couldn't hear him. "I love you so much, and I'm sorry I haven't shown it enough. I'm sorry I let work become more important than you, I'm sorry for all of it." Caleb couldn't hear the words, but perhaps he felt them in the way Richard held him in the trembling of his father's shoulders. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb's eyes were wet too. He signed, "It's going to be okay, Dad. We have Grace. We have each other. That's enough." Richard nodded, not trusting himself to sign back. Caleb yawned, then suddenly looking every bit the 10-year-old he was. Richard tucked him back under the covers, smoothing his son's hair back from his forehead. "Sleep," he signed. "Tomorrow is Christmas." Caleb smiled sleepily and signed, "Will you be here in the morning?" Richard made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Yes, I'll be here." He left Caleb's room and found Grace still in the living room, sitting by the Christmas tree, the lights reflected in the windows doubling their glow. "Thank you," Richard said, "for talking to him, for helping him understand." Grace looked up at him. "Mr. Harrison, can I tell you something? Please call me Richard." "Richard," she corrected. "When Joshua died, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. I couldn't imagine how I would go on, what purpose I could possibly have without him." She paused, looking at the Christmas tree lights. "But then I realized something. Joshua didn't just teach deaf children to play piano. He taught me that the most important things in life can't be taken away by circumstances. Love, purpose, hope. Those things exist even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times." Richard sat down beside her. "I'm losing everything I've spent my adult life building." "No," Grace said firmly. "You're losing buildings and money and reputation. Those things can be rebuilt. But you're not losing what matters. You're not losing Caleb. You're not losing yourself. And maybe, just maybe, losing everything else will help you see what you've had all along." Richard wanted to believe her, but sitting there in his penthouse that he might not own much longer, watching the Christmas lights twinkle on a tree decorated for a son he'd neglected, knowing that in the morning he'd have to go back to dealing with lawyers and angry investors, and his imploding business belief felt very far away. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be the father Caleb needs when my whole world is falling apart." Grace smiled, sad and knowing. "Yes, you do. You just showed him. You came home tonight even though you're exhausted. You went to his room, you held him. You made a promise to be here tomorrow. That's how you do it. One moment at a time. One choice at a time." They sat in silence for a while, the two of them keeping vigil in the quiet of Christmas Eve, both thinking about the children they loved and the uncertainties ahead. Finally, Grace stood. "I should go home. My sister will worry," Grace, Richard said, stopping her. "Whatever happens with my business, whatever happens next, I want you to know that you've changed our lives. Caleb is happier than I've seen him in years. And that's because of you." Grace squeezed his shoulder gently. "Caleb is happier because he found hope. I just showed him where to look for it. And Richard, you're going to find it too. Maybe not where you expect, but you'll find it." After she left, Richard sat alone in the dark living room. Through the windows, he could see the city, a million lights representing a million lives going on, despite his personal catastrophe. His phone buzzed with another angry email from an investor. He ignored it. Instead, he thought about Caleb's words. "We have Grace. We have each other. That's enough." Maybe the boy was wiser than his father had ever given him credit for. Maybe enough was all they needed. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow falling over Manhattan, turning the city into something from a postcard. Richard kept his promise. He was there when Caleb woke up, sitting in the living room with coffee, watching the snow fall. His phone was off. The lawyers and investors and journalists could wait one day. Today was for his son. Caleb came padding out of his room in pajamas, saw his father, and his face lit up with surprised joy. He signed, "You stayed." Richard signed back, "I promised." They had breakfast together, just the two of them. Richard made scrambled eggs that were slightly burned and toast that was slightly too dark. But Caleb ate every bite with enthusiasm. They opened presents, simple things, mostly because Richard hadn't had time to shop properly. But Caleb didn't seem to care about the gifts. He just kept smiling at his father like Richard had given him something far more valuable than any toy. Around noon, Grace arrived with her sister, a warm woman named Patricia, who brought homemade sweet potato pie and stories that made Caleb laugh. They all had Christmas dinner together, a mismatched gathering of people thrown together by circumstance, who were becoming something like a family. After dinner, as darkness fell early in the winter evening, Richard retreated to his office. He couldn't avoid the crisis forever. He opened his laptop and began wading through the hundreds of emails that had accumulated. The news wasn't good. 3 more investors had pulled out. The structural engineers were recommending a complete demolition and rebuild of Sterling Tower. The lawsuits were piling up. Richard's net worth had dropped by 60% in less than a week. He was reading through a particularly vicious email from a former business partner when he heard a crash from somewhere in the apartment. Richard jumped up and ran toward the sound. It had come from Grace's room, the small bedroom off the kitchen that Richard had given her because she sometimes stayed late with Caleb. He found Caleb standing in the doorway of Grace's room, looking stricken. On the floor was a wooden box, its contents spilled across the carpet. Grace was on her knees, gathering up the items carefully, and even from the doorway, Richard could see that her hands were shaking. "What happened?" Richard asked. Caleb's hands moved frantically. "I'm sorry. I was looking for Grace. I didn't mean to knock it over. I'm so sorry." Grace looked up and Richard saw tears on her cheeks, but she wasn't angry. She gestured to Caleb. "It's all right, sweetheart. It's okay. Come here." Caleb knelt beside her, and together they picked up the scattered items. Richard moved closer and saw what had been in the box. Photographs. Dozens of them. A young man with Grace's eyes and a brilliant smile captured at various ages. Baby pictures, school photos, graduation in a cap and gown, professional headshots. And in many of the photos, the young man was at a piano. This was Joshua. There were other things, too. A medal from some music competition, a program from a recital, newspaper clippings with headlines Richard could only partially read from his angle. And there beneath all of it was the keyboard Richard had seen Caleb using Joshua's keyboard. Grace picked up one particular photograph and held it for a long moment. It showed Joshua, at maybe 25, sitting at a grand piano in what looked like a concert hall. His hands were on the keys, his eyes closed, his expression one of complete peace. "This was his last performance," Grace said softly, speaking aloud, even though Caleb couldn't hear. 3 months before he died. He played for 200 people that day. Half of them were deaf, half hearing. Everyone cried. Even the people who could hear said they'd never experienced music that way before. Pure and honest, and somehow more real than anything they'd heard. She traced her finger over Joshua's face in the photograph. Caleb was watching her intently, and even though he couldn't hear her words, he seemed to understand the emotion behind them. Grace looked at Caleb and began to sign. "You remind me so much of him. Not just because you're both deaf, but because you have the same curiosity, the same determination, the same light. Joshua would have loved meeting you. Caleb signed back. I wish I could have met him. You are meeting him, Grace signed. Every time you play the keyboard, every time you feel the music, you're meeting him. His gift, his discovery. It lives on through you. Caleb looked down at the keyboard lying among the photographs. He reached out and touched it, gently, reverently. Can you tell me more about him? Caleb signed. About what he learned, how he did it. Grace glanced at Richard, a question in her eyes. Richard nodded. He wanted to know too. Grace carefully gathered the photographs and mementos back into the box, then set it aside. She picked up the keyboard and placed it on the bed. Then she sat down, and Caleb and Richard sat on either side of her. She began to sign her hands, moving in the fluid, graceful way that meant she was about to tell a story. Joshua discovered something that the medical community still doesn't fully understand. She began speaking aloud as she signed for Caleb's benefit and Richard's. He discovered that music isn't just sound, it's vibration pattern frequency, and the human body is capable of perceiving those things even without hearing. She placed Caleb's hand on the keyboard. When you press a key, what happens? Caleb thought for a moment, then signed. The string inside vibrates exactly, and that vibration travels through the air, yes, which is how hearing people perceive it, but also through solid objects, through the keyboard itself, through whatever the keyboard is sitting on, through the floor, through your hands, through the bench you're sitting on. She pressed a key, and Richard watched Caleb's eyes widen slightly. Joshua spent months mapping out how different notes felt. Different. Grace continued, a low C has a slow, deep vibration. A high C vibrates much faster, feels lighter, almost tingling. The notes in between have their own unique signatures. Joshua could identify any note just by feeling it. How long did it take him to learn Caleb signed? 2 years to become truly proficient. But he started seeing results within weeks. The first time he played a simple melody correctly, he was 16 years old, and he cried. So did I. Grace smiled at the memory, bittersweet. But it wasn't just about identifying notes, she went on. Joshua discovered that when notes are played together, their vibrations interact. Create patterns. Harmony feels different from discord. A major chord feels open and bright. A minor chord feels darker, more complex. Joshua learned to read these patterns like you might read words on a page. Richard leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. But how is that possible? How can someone feel the difference between major and minor? Grace looked at him. How can you taste the difference between sweet and sour? They're both just chemicals on your tongue, but your brain interprets them differently. Joshua's brain learned to interpret vibrations the same way, with practice, with repetition, with dedication. She turned back to Caleb. And there was something else Joshua discovered, something even more important. What Caleb signed completely absorbed. Grace's hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if the words themselves were precious. He discovered that when you play music, when you create those vibrations yourself, you connect to something larger. Music isn't just about perceiving sound. It's about creating emotion, expressing what words can't capture, touching something deep in the human soul. And that experience, that connection, doesn't require hearing. It requires feeling, being present, being open. She picked up the keyboard and handed it to Caleb. Joshua used to say that hearing people listen to music. But deaf musicians feel music. They experience it in their whole body, in their bones, in their heartbeat. He said it was more intimate, more real, because there was no distance between the music and the person creating it. Caleb held the keyboard like it was made of gold. He signed to Grace. "Will you teach me everything he learned?" Grace nodded. "Everything I can." "But Caleb, you need to understand something. This isn't going to be easy. Learning to play music through feeling alone takes dedication. Practice, patience. There will be days when you're frustrated, when you want to give up, when it feels impossible." "I won't give up." Caleb signed fiercely. "I promise." Grace smiled and cupped his face gently. "I know you won't. You have Joshua's spirit, his determination. And I promise you, if you stick with this, you're going to discover something beautiful. Not just music, but a part of yourself you didn't know existed." Richard watched this exchange, his throat tight with emotion. Here was this woman who had lost everything, her only child taken from her in a senseless accident, and she was pouring all of her grief and love and knowledge into his son. She was giving Caleb the gift that Joshua had spent his life perfecting. "Grace," Richard said, and both she and Caleb turned to look at him. "I need to tell you something about my business situation." Grace's expression became serious. "It's worse, it's bad. Very bad. I'm probably going to lose everything. This apartment, the company, all of it. I might not be able to pay you much longer." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think I'm doing this for the money?" The question caught Richard off guard. No, but you need to work. You need income. I can't expect you to." Grace held up a hand, stopping him. "Mr. Harrison, Richard, when Joshua died, I lost my purpose. I lost my reason for getting up in the morning. I went through the motions of living, but I was empty inside. And then I met Caleb. And I realized that Joshua's work didn't have to die with him, that his discovery, his gift, could live on." She looked at Caleb, then back at Richard. "You could fire me tomorrow, and I would still show up at your door to teach Caleb. You could lose every penny and move into a tiny apartment, and I would follow you there. Because this isn't about money. This is about honoring my son's legacy. This is about giving another child the miracle that Joshua experienced." Richard felt tears sting his eyes. "I don't deserve your kindness." "It's not about deserving," Grace said simply. "It's about need. Caleb needs this. You need this. And honestly, I need this too. We need each other. That's how this works." Caleb had been watching this exchange, and even though he could only follow Grace's signs, not Richard's spoken words, he seemed to understand the emotional weight of the conversation. He stood up suddenly and hugged Grace tightly. Then he turned and hugged his father with equal fierceness. The three of them stood there in Grace's small bedroom, surrounded by photographs of a young man who had died too soon, holding on to each other like lifelines in a storm. Richard's phone was buzzing in his pocket. More bad news, more crisis, more chaos waiting for his attention. But for this moment, he ignored it. For this moment, there was only this. The three of them. Together. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. Later that night, after Grace had gone home, and Caleb was asleep, Richard sat in his office staring at financial reports that painted a grim picture. By his calculations, he had maybe 4 months before he had to declare bankruptcy. 4 months before they'd lose the penthouse, before he'd have to sell off everything he owned just to stay afloat. 4 months to figure out how to rebuild his life from scratch. But as he sat there in the dark, Richard realized something. He was scared. Yes. The prospect of losing everything he'd worked for was terrifying, but he wasn't hopeless. Because he'd seen something tonight. He'd seen his son holding a keyboard like it was a treasure beyond price. He'd seen Grace pouring her grief and love into teaching. He'd seen that there were things in this world that couldn't be taken away by financial collapse, or lawsuits, or disaster. Love, purpose, connection, hope. Those things couldn't be bought with money, and they couldn't be destroyed by losing it either. Richard closed his laptop and went to check on Caleb one last time before bed. The boy was sleeping peacefully. His hand curled on the pillow, a small smile on his face. On his nightstand, Richard saw a new drawing. It showed 3 people, crude stick figures the way a child draws. One tall figure labeled Dad, one shorter figure labeled Me, and one figure in the middle labeled Grace. They were all holding hands, and above them Caleb had drawn musical notes raining down like stars. Richard picked up the drawing carefully and carried it to his own room. He propped it up on his dresser where he would see it first thing in the morning. A reminder of what mattered. A reminder of what he was fighting for. Not buildings or money or reputation, but this small, impossible family they were building from broken pieces. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Teaching Caleb music, salvaging what he could of his business, learning to be the father he should have been all along. But tonight, Richard Harrison allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, grace could be found even in the wreckage of everything falling apart. The day after Christmas, Grace arrived early with a determination in her step that Richard had come to recognize. She had a plan. "We're going to start properly today," she told Richard over coffee while Caleb still slept. "No more casual experimentation. Real lessons. Structure, method." "What do you need?" Richard asked. Grace pulled out a worn notebook from her bag. This was Joshua's training journal. Every exercise he developed, every technique he discovered, every breakthrough he documented. It's all here. We're going to use his method exactly. Richard took the notebook carefully. The pages were filled with Joshua's handwriting diagrams, showing hand positions, musical notation with notes about vibration patterns, even sketches of different piano configurations and how they affected sound transmission. He was a scientist, Richard said, with wonder. He was a pioneer, Grace corrected. He had to be. No one had done this before. He had to invent everything from scratch. She took the notebook back and flipped to a page near the beginning. This is where we start. The foundation. Teaching Caleb to recognize 8 basic notes by their vibration signature. 8 notes. Why 8? It's what Joshua determined was the optimal number for beginning. Too few, and you can't make interesting patterns. Too many, and it becomes overwhelming. 8 notes give us an octave. Enough to play simple melodies. Richard nodded, trusting her expertise, even though part of him still couldn't quite believe this was possible. 10 years of doctors saying it couldn't be done, and here was Grace with her son's notebook, calmly explaining how to teach a deaf child to play music. When Caleb woke up and joined them for breakfast, Grace signed to him about the plan. His reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Today, we start today. Today, Grace confirmed. Are you ready? More ready than I've ever been for anything. After breakfast, Grace transformed the living room into a music studio. She moved furniture, repositioning the coffee table to be more stable. She took Joshua's keyboard and set it up carefully, making sure it was plugged in and the volume was at maximum. Then she did something unexpected. She placed the keyboard not on top of the table, but directly on the floor on the hard wood, with nothing underneath it. Richard watched, confused. Wouldn't it be better on the table? You'd think so, Grace said. But Joshua discovered that vibrations transfer better through direct contact with the floor. The wood conducts the sound waves, and they spread out more evenly. Plus, Caleb can sit on the floor with his whole body in contact with the same surface as the keyboard. He'll feel it everywhere, not just in his hands. She pulled out 8 colored stickers from her bag and carefully placed them on 8 keys of the keyboard, spanning an octave. Each sticker was a different color rainbow order, red through purple. Each color represents a note, Grace explained. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and back to C. We're going to teach Caleb to recognize each vibration pattern and associate it with the color. Once he has that foundation, we can build from there. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Grace set up with intense focus. He reached out and touched one of the colored stickers, then looked up at Grace with a question in his eyes. Grace sat down across from him, the keyboard between them. She began to sign and speak aloud for Richard's benefit. Today, we're going to learn the language of vibration, she said. Just like you learned to read words, we're going to learn to read feelings. Each of these 8 notes has its own personality, its own feeling. Your job is to become friends with each one, to know them so well that you could recognize them in the dark with your eyes closed. How Caleb signed. We start simple. First, we're just going to feel them, one at a time. No pressure, no test, just experiencing. Grace pressed the first key, the one with the red sticker. She held it down for several seconds, letting the vibration sustain. Caleb had his hands flat on the floor on either side of the keyboard, and Richard could see the moment the vibration reached him. His eyes widened slightly. His whole body became still focused. Grace released the key and signed. What did that feel like? Caleb thought for a moment, then signed low. Heavy, like a heartbeat, but deeper. Grace smiled. Perfect. That's C, the red note. Now close your eyes. I'm going to play it again, and I want you to really focus on how it feels, not just in your hands, but everywhere. Your arms, your legs, your chest. The vibration travels through your whole body. Caleb closed his eyes. Grace played the note again, holding it longer this time. Richard watched his son's face transform. The usual tension that Caleb carried, the guardedness that came from living in a world that didn't accommodate him, melted away. He looked peaceful, present, completely absorbed in the sensation. When Grace released the key, Caleb's eyes opened slowly, like someone waking from a dream. Again, he signed. Again, Grace confirmed. They went through this process with each of the 8 notes. Grace would play 1. Caleb would feel it. They would discuss what it was like. The higher notes were lighter, faster tickling. The middle notes were warm, friendly, comfortable. Each one had its own character, its own feeling. This went on for an hour, just experiencing no pressure to remember or perform. Grace was patient, never rushing, always giving Caleb time to fully absorb each note. Richard sat on the couch, watching, forgotten by both of them, and he found himself mesmerized. He'd never thought about music this way. He'd always taken it for granted, something his ears processed automatically, without conscious thought. But watching Caleb learn to perceive sound through pure sensation, he realized how much more complex and beautiful music was than he'd ever appreciated. Finally, Grace signed to Caleb, ready to try something new. Caleb nodded eagerly. Grace's hands moved in explanation. Now I'm going to play 2 notes in a row. Red, then orange, C, then D. I want you to feel the difference between them. How they're similar, how they're different. She played C, held it, released it. Then D, held it, released it. Caleb's brow furrowed in concentration. He signed, "The second one is higher, lighter. Yes, exactly." Grace's signs were enthusiastic. Did you feel how they're related but different? Like siblings. Caleb nodded, a smile starting to spread across his face. Let's try it again. This time faster. Grace played C, D, C, D, creating a simple, alternating pattern. Caleb's hands remained flat on the floor, but his head started to move slightly unconsciously, following the rhythm. Now Grace signed, "I'm going to play 3 notes. Red, orange, yellow. C, D, E. This is the beginning of a scale, the beginning of music." She played the 3 notes slowly, deliberately, with space between each one for Caleb to process. Then she played them again a little faster, and again faster still, until they started to flow together into something that resembled a melody. Caleb's entire face lit up. His hands came up in excited signs. I can hear it. Not here, but I can feel the pattern. It's like a story. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Richard saw her blink them back quickly, staying professional, staying focused. Exactly, she signed. That's exactly what music is. Patterns that tell stories. And you're reading the story through feeling instead of sound. But it's the same story, the same language. Can I try? Caleb signed, almost bouncing with excitement. Of course! Caleb leaned forward and placed his fingers on the 3 colored keys Grace had just played. Red, orange, yellow. He pressed them one at a time, slowly feeling the vibration of each, before moving to the next. C, D, E. The notes came out hesitant, uncertain, but in the right order. Caleb looked up at Grace with an expression of pure wonder. I did it. I played music. You did, Grace confirmed. That was your first melody. Caleb turned to his father, and Richard realized he had tears running down his face. He didn't bother to wipe them away. You did it, Richard said, even though Caleb couldn't hear him. You played music. Caleb launched himself at his father, wrapping his arms around Richard's neck. Richard held his son tightly, feeling the boy trembling with excitement and joy. Over Caleb's shoulder, Richard met Grace's eyes. She was smiling, but there was sadness there too. He realized she was seeing Joshua in this moment, remembering her own son's first breakthrough. Thank you, Richard mouthed to her. Grace nodded, accepting his gratitude with quiet dignity. When Caleb finally pulled back, he was signing rapidly, too fast for Richard to follow. Grace laughed and slowed him down, translating. He wants to know if he can practice, if he can learn more notes, if we can do this every day, if maybe someday he could play a real song. Grace turned to Caleb and signed, We can do this every single day. And yes, someday you're going to play real songs. Beautiful songs. Songs that will make people cry. I promise you. How long? Caleb signed. How long until I can play a real song? Grace considered this. Joshua did it in about 6 months. But everyone's different. Some people learn faster, some slower. It doesn't matter how long it takes. What matters is that you keep practicing, keep feeling, keep learning. I will. Caleb signed with fierce determination. I'll practice every day. I promise. Then we'll get there. Grace signed. Together. They practiced for another hour. Just those 3 notes. Grace had Caleb play them forward-backward in different rhythms, with different amounts of pressure on the keys. Each variation created a slightly different feeling, and Caleb absorbed it all like a sponge. By the time Grace called the session to an end, Caleb's fingers were tired, and his body was exhausted from the intense concentration. But he was happier than Richard had ever seen him. That night after dinner, after Caleb's regular bath and bedtime routine, Richard went to tuck him in. Caleb was lying in bed, but his hands were moving, practicing the fingering patterns Grace had taught him even without a keyboard. Richard signed goodnight, then added something he'd learned from Grace. "Tomorrow we practice more." Caleb's response was immediate. "Can't wait." Richard turned off the light and was almost out the door when he saw Caleb signing something else, small movements in the dim light from the hallway. "Dad." Richard turned back. "Yes? Do you think Mom would be proud of me?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. Sarah, his wife, Caleb's mother, who had died before seeing her son grow into this remarkable boy. Richard crossed back to the bed and sat down. He signed slowly, making sure Caleb could see in the low light. "Your mother would be more proud than you could possibly imagine. She would love that you're learning music. She would love how brave you are, how determined. She would love everything about you." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she can see me? Wherever she is?" Richard wasn't sure he believed in an afterlife, but in that moment he wanted to, desperately. "Yes," he signed. "I think she sees you, and I think she's smiling." Caleb nodded, satisfied. "Then I love you, Dad." "I love you too," Richard signed back. "More than all the stars in the sky." It was something Sarah used to say to Caleb when he was a baby before they knew about his deafness, before everything became so complicated. Caleb smiled, and Richard wondered if somehow the boy remembered. He left Caleb's room and found Grace gathering her things to head home. "How did he do?" Richard asked. "Really? Not just proud father assessment, your professional opinion." Grace stopped packing her bag and looked at him seriously. He did better than Joshua did in his first session. He has a natural sensitivity to vibration, and more importantly, he has the mindset, the patience, the willingness to fail and try again. Those are the things that matter most. Do you really think he can do this? "Learn to play properly," Grace said, and her voice was firm, certain. "I don't just think it, I know it. That child has something special. Give him 6 months and he'll be playing melodies that will make you weep. Give him a year and he'll be composing his own music. Give him 5 years." She trailed off, shaking her head with a smile. 5 years from now, Caleb is going to be extraordinary. Mark my words. Richard wanted to believe her, but he also knew the reality of their situation. What if we can't afford to stay here? What if I lose everything and we have to move to a smaller place somewhere you can't easily get to? Then I'll get there however I need to, Grace said simply. Bus, subway, walk if I have to. I told you, Richard, this isn't about the money or the location. This is about Caleb. And nothing is going to stop me from seeing this through. After Grace left, Richard stood at the window of his penthouse, looking out at the glittering city. Somewhere out there, lawyers were preparing lawsuits against him. Investors were calculating their losses. Journalists were writing articles about his downfall. But in this space that might not be his much longer, his son had just played his first notes of music. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like victory. January brought bitter cold and brutal revelations. The structural problems with Sterling Tower were even worse than initially assessed. The entire foundation would need to be demolished and rebuilt from scratch. The cost, $700 million. Richard had insurance, but not nearly enough to cover it. His company had liquidity for maybe another month before insolvency. Richard spent his days in conference rooms and courtrooms fighting a losing battle to save his business empire. He watched decades of work crumble in slow motion, watched partnerships dissolve and opportunities evaporate. But every afternoon at 3 o'clock, he came home. Because that was when Caleb's music lessons started, and Richard had promised himself he wouldn't miss a single one. Grace was a patient but demanding teacher. She pushed Caleb hard, never letting him get comfortable, always raising the bar just as he reached the previous goal. By the end of the first week, Caleb could identify all 8 basic notes by vibration alone. Grace would play them in random order, and Caleb would correctly identify which color sticker, which note, every single time. By the end of the second week, Caleb was playing simple scales up and down his fingers, finding the right keys with increasing confidence. By the end of the third week, he played his first complete melody. Mary had a little lamb. Just 5 notes, simple as breathing for most children learning music. But for Caleb, for a deaf boy who was experiencing music for the first time in his life, it was nothing short of miraculous. Richard watched his son play that simple melody, and he wept. Grace added more notes to Caleb's vocabulary. 9, 10, 12 notes. More colored stickers appeared on the keyboard, extending the range. Caleb absorbed it all with ferocious determination. But it wasn't just about technical skill. Grace was teaching Caleb something deeper. One afternoon, Richard came home early and found them in the living room. The keyboard was silent. Instead, Grace and Caleb were sitting on the floor, and Grace had her hands on Caleb's chest just over his heart. Richard stood in the doorway watching. Grace's hands moved in signs. Music isn't just patterns. It's emotion, feeling. When you play, you're not just pressing keys. You're telling the world what's in your heart. But I can't hear what my heart sounds like, Caleb signed back. Grace smiled. You don't need to hear it. You need to feel it. Close your eyes. Caleb closed his eyes. Now Grace signed. I want you to think about something that makes you happy. Really happy. Hold that feeling. Caleb's face softened, a small smile appearing. Feel where that happiness lives in your body? Grace continued. Is it in your chest? Your stomach? Your throat? Caleb's hand moved to his chest. Here he signed. It feels warm here. Good. Remember that feeling. Now, I want you to imagine that feeling has a vibration. If that happiness could shake your whole body, what would it feel like? Fast or slow, light or heavy? Caleb thought about this, his face scrunched in concentration. Fast, he signed eventually. Light, like bubbles. Perfect. Now keep your eyes closed and play anything. Don't think about right notes or wrong notes. Just try to make vibrations that feel like that happiness feels, like bubbles in your chest. Caleb opened his eyes just long enough to find the keyboard, then closed them again. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment. Then he began to play. The notes were random at first, no clear pattern. But there was something there, something emerging. Higher notes mostly played quickly with a lightness in the touch. It wasn't a song exactly, it wasn't even a melody, but it was expression. It was communication. It was music. When Caleb finished, he opened his eyes and looked at Grace uncertainly. Was that okay? Grace had tears streaming down her face. She pulled Caleb into a fierce hug. That was more than okay. That was beautiful. That was you, your soul speaking through your hands. That was what music is supposed to be. Caleb looked confused, but pleased. Can I do it again? As many times as you want. Try different feelings. Sadness, excitement, fear, peace. Every emotion has its own music. You just have to find it. From the doorway, Richard watched this unfold with awe. Grace wasn't just teaching Caleb to play music. She was teaching him to express himself in a way he never had before. She was giving him a voice. That evening after Grace went home, Richard found Caleb at the keyboard practicing. Not scales or exercises, but those emotional expressions Grace had shown him. He was playing sadness now, Richard realized. Slow, low notes, minor chords that Grace had introduced vibrations that felt heavy and dark. Richard sat down beside his son. He didn't interrupt, just watched and listened. When Caleb finished, Richard signed, "That was sad music." "What were you thinking about?" Caleb's hands moved slowly. "Mom. I was thinking about Mom and how I miss her, how I wish she could see me play." Richard felt his throat tighten. She would be so proud. "I wish I remembered her better," Caleb signed. "I was so little when she died. Sometimes I forget what she looked like until I see pictures." Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photo album until he found a video he hadn't watched in years. It was Sarah, about a month before she died, holding baby Caleb. She was singing to him a lullaby, swaying gently. Caleb couldn't hear it in the video any more than he'd heard it then, but Sarah hadn't known yet that her son was deaf. She sang to him with complete joy, complete love. Richard showed Caleb the video. The boy watched intently, studying his mother's face, the way she held him, the obvious adoration in her expression. When the video ended, Caleb signed, "She was beautiful. And she looked so happy. She was happy. You made her so happy." Caleb watched the video again, and then again. Finally, he looked up at Richard. "Can I try something?" "Of course." Caleb turned to the keyboard. His hands found the keys, and he began to play. Slowly at first, tentatively, then with more confidence. It was a melody Richard didn't recognize, simple, but hauntingly beautiful. Caleb played it through once, then again, with slight variations. The third time he added more notes, creating harmony. When he finished, he signed to his father, "That's for Mom. That's what she feels like to me from the video. Happy and warm and safe." Richard couldn't speak. He just pulled his son close and held him while his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Caleb patted his back, comforting his father in the age-old way of children who are wiser than they should have to be. "It's okay to be sad," Caleb signed when Richard finally pulled back. "Grace says music helps with sad. It lets the sad come out so it doesn't stay stuck inside." "Grace is very wise," Richard signed. "The best teacher," Caleb agreed. Then he added, almost shyly, "But you're the best dad." Richard's heart, which had felt broken beyond repair these past weeks, suddenly felt a little bit whole again. The next morning, Richard received the call he'd been dreading. His CFO, Michael, his voice tight with stress. "It's over, Richard. The board voted. We're filing for bankruptcy. End of the month." Richard had known it was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. The penthouse. "We'll need to liquidate everything. Properties, assets, all of it. You'll have maybe 90 days to find new housing. What about employee severance, the staff? We'll do what we can, but it won't be much. I'm sorry, Richard. I know how hard you fought." After Michael hung up, Richard sat in his office staring at nothing. 30 years of work, gone. He would have to tell Caleb they were losing their home. He would have to tell Grace that he couldn't pay her anymore. He would have to figure out how to start over from nothing at 43 years old with a son depending on him. The fear was enormous, threatening to swallow him whole. But then Richard heard something from the living room. Music. Caleb practicing the notes, coming faster now, more confident. That melody he'd composed for his mother, being refined, improved. Richard stood up and walked to the living room. Caleb saw him and stopped playing. "Everything okay?" Caleb signed, worry on his face. Richard could have lied, could have said it was fine, protected his son from the harsh reality for a little longer. Instead, he sat down beside Caleb and signed the truth. "We're losing the apartment. My business is bankrupt. We're going to have to move somewhere smaller." He watched his son's face, waiting for fear, for panic, for tears. Instead, Caleb thought for a moment, then signed, "Will we still have the keyboard?" Richard almost laughed. "Yes, we'll have the keyboard. And Grace. Will Grace still be able to teach me?" Richard had been worried about this. "I don't know if I can pay her anymore, but I'll talk to her. We'll figure something out." Caleb nodded, accepting this. Then he signed, "Dad, can I tell you something? Of course. I'm sorry you're losing your business. I know you worked really hard on it." But the boy hesitated, then continued, "I kind of like that you're home more now. I like that we have dinner together and you watch me practice. I like having you here." Richard stared at his son, this wise, generous child who was finding the silver lining in his father's catastrophic failure. "When did you get so smart?" Richard asked aloud, forgetting again that Caleb couldn't hear him. But Caleb must have read something in his expression, because he smiled and signed, "I learned it from Grace. She says every ending is also a beginning. We just have to look for it." Richard pulled Caleb into a hug. "You're right. This is an ending. But maybe it's also a chance to start something new, something better." Like what Richard didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe there could be an answer. Maybe this disaster wasn't just destruction. Maybe it was clearing space for something new to grow. Maybe Grace was right. Things had to fall apart sometimes, so new things could take root. That afternoon, when Grace arrived for Caleb's lesson, Richard pulled her aside. "I need to tell you something," he said. "We're losing the apartment, bankruptcy. I won't be able to pay you after this month." Grace's expression didn't change. Okay, that's it. You're not worried about the money?" "No." Grace set down her bag. "I told you, Richard, I'm not doing this for the money. Where are you moving to?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere cheaper. Queens, maybe, or Brooklyn. Something I can afford until I figure out what comes next." Grace nodded. "Then I'll come to Queens or Brooklyn. This doesn't change anything for me." "Grace, I can't ask you to work for free. You're not asking. I'm offering." Caleb is about to break through to the next level. In the next few months, he's going to start truly understanding music, not just mechanically, but artistically. I'm not walking away from that. Not for anything. Richard felt emotion welling up again. These days he cried more than he had in the previous 40 years combined. Why, he asked. "Why are you doing all this for us?" Grace was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Then she said, "When Joshua died, I wanted to die too. The only thing that kept me going was knowing that his work mattered, that his discovery could help other children like him. And then I met Caleb, and I realized Joshua sent me to him, sent me to both of you." She looked Richard in the eye. "You're not a charity case to me, Richard. You're family. Caleb is giving Joshua's dream a future. And you're giving me a purpose. We need each other. That's not about money. It's about something much more valuable." "What's that?" Grace smiled. "Hope. We're giving each other hope." Richard nodded, unable to speak. Grace patted his arm gently. "Now let's go teach your son some advanced chord progressions. He's ready for them." That lesson was different from all the ones before. Grace introduced Caleb to the concept of chords, multiple notes played simultaneously, creating complex vibration patterns. She showed him how major chords felt open and bright, how minor chords felt darker and more complex. Caleb absorbed it all with the same fierce focus he brought to everything. But Richard noticed something new. His son wasn't just learning anymore. He was experimenting. Playing combinations of notes Grace hadn't shown him, discovering on his own what sounded good, what felt right. Caleb was becoming a musician. At one point, Caleb played a combination of notes that made Grace's breath catch. She signed to him. "Where did you learn that? I didn't learn it." Caleb signed back. "I just tried it. Does it sound okay? More than okay. That's beautiful. Do you know what you just did? What you created, something new. Something that didn't exist before. That's not just playing music. That's composing it." Caleb's eyes went wide. "Really, really? You're not just a student anymore, Caleb. You're becoming an artist." Richard watched his son process this information, saw the moment it landed, saw Caleb's entire posture change as he realized what Grace was telling him. He wasn't just learning to experience music. He was learning to create it. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in bed in the dark, thinking about everything. The bankruptcy, the impending move, the uncertain future, but also his son playing music, Grace's unwavering support, the small family they were building from broken pieces. Around 2 a.m, he heard a sound from down the hall. Music. Richard got up and walked quietly to the living room. Caleb was there in his pajamas, sitting at the keyboard in the dark. The boy was playing softly, working through something, stopping and starting, trying different combinations. Richard stood in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. Caleb played a phrase, then played it again, slightly differently. He was composing, Richard realized. Creating music of his own. And even though the boy couldn't hear what he was creating, even though he was experiencing it only through vibration, the music was beautiful, haunting and sad and hopeful all at once. Richard must have made a sound because Caleb turned and saw him. "Sorry," the boy signed. "Did I wake you?" "No, I couldn't sleep." Richard came into the room. "What are you working on?" Caleb's hands moved shyly. "A song about us, about losing things but finding new things, about being sad and happy at the same time. Can I hear it?" Caleb nodded and turned back to the keyboard. He played what he'd been working on, a melody that started low and melancholy, then gradually climbed higher, becoming more hopeful, finally resolving in something that felt like peace. When he finished, he looked at his father anxiously. "Is it good?" Richard signed back, his hands trembling. "It's perfect. You're an artist, Caleb. A real artist." Caleb smiled, then yawned hugely. "Bed," Richard signed. "You need sleep." 5 more minutes, Richard considered, then nodded. 5 more minutes. Then sleep. He sat on the couch while Caleb returned to his composing, working out the details of his song about loss and hope and transformation. And Richard Harrison, who had lost everything except what mattered most, finally understood what Grace had been trying to tell him all along. Music wasn't just sound. It was the language of the soul. And his son was learning to speak it fluently. February arrived with a mix of endings and beginnings. Richard officially filed for bankruptcy. The court proceedings were humiliating, every detail of his financial collapse laid bare for public consumption. Journalists wrote gleeful articles about his downfall. Former business partners avoided his calls. The empire he'd built was dismantled piece by piece. But something unexpected was happening too. As Richard stopped trying to save his failing business, and started focusing on what came next, he discovered he had skills beyond real estate development. He knew construction, knew buildings, knew how to manage complex projects. Within 2 weeks of his bankruptcy, filing, 3 different construction firms had approached him about consulting work. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would restore his former wealth, but honest work that would pay the bills. He accepted a position with Morrison Construction, a mid-sized firm that specialized in affordable housing. The pay was a fraction of what he'd been earning, but it was steady, and more importantly, the hours were reasonable. He could be home for Caleb's lessons. He could be present. They found an apartment in Queens, a modest 2-bedroom in a building that was 40 years old but well-maintained. It was 1/20th the size of the penthouse, with linoleum floors and appliances from the 1990s. The first time Caleb saw it, he looked around the tiny living room and signed, "It's cozy." Richard had laughed, recognizing his son's diplomatic way of saying it was small. But you know what Caleb had added. The floors are wood, good for vibrations. The boy had his priorities straight. They moved in mid-February. Grace showed up on moving day with her sister Patricia, and together they helped transform the bare apartment into something like a home. Grace set up the keyboard in the corner of the living room where it would get good natural light. She hung some of Caleb's drawings on the walls. She brought a plant for the kitchen windowsill. There, she said when they'd finished. Now it's home. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like one. Caleb's progress was accelerating. By late February, he could play complete songs. Simple ones, still children's melodies and basic classical pieces, but he played them with emotion and understanding. He understood not just the technical aspects, but the feeling behind the music. Grace introduced him to different genres: classical jazz, blues, even rock. Each style had its own personality, its own emotional vocabulary. Caleb absorbed it all, his musical language expanding daily. But more than that, he was composing. Every few days, Caleb would present a new piece he'd created. Some were short, just 30 seconds of melody. Others were longer, more complex, with multiple movements and emotional shifts. Grace recorded everything on her phone, creating an archive of Caleb's musical journey. One evening, she played one of these recordings for Richard. It was a piece Caleb had composed the previous week, something he called Grace's Song. Richard listened, and even through the tinny phone speaker, he could hear the beauty in it. The melody was gentle and sad, but with an undercurrent of strength. It was unmistakably about Grace herself, about her grief for Joshua and her love for Caleb, about loss transformed into purpose. "He understands me," Grace said softly when the recording ended. "Without hearing my voice, without being able to hear the tone of my words, he understands who I am." And he captured it in music. "He loves you," Richard said. "We both do. You saved us, Grace." "No," Grace corrected. "We saved each other. That's how this works." In March, Grace made an announcement that shocked Richard. "I think Caleb is ready for a real piano," she said. They were sitting in Richard's tiny kitchen drinking coffee while Caleb did his regular schoolwork in his room. "A real piano," Richard repeated. "Grace, I can barely afford this apartment. I can't buy a piano. I'm not asking you to buy one. I'm asking you to let me bring Joshua's piano here." Richard stared at her. Joshua had a piano, the old upright from our apartment, the one he learned on. "It's been in storage since he died. I've been paying to keep it there, but it should be here. It should be played. Joshua would want Caleb to have it." "Grace, that's too much. It's too important to you." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "It's important to me that it's used, that it continues Joshua's work." Please, Richard. Let me do this." The piano arrived the following weekend, delivered by two burly movers who somehow maneuvered it up the narrow stairs to Richard's second-floor apartment. It was old and battered, the wood scarred and the finish worn, but when Grace opened the lid and pressed a key, the sound was beautiful. Caleb stood in front of it, awed. He reached out and touched it reverently, then looked at Grace with wide eyes. "This was Joshua's," he signed. Grace nodded. "And now it's yours. He would be so happy to know you're playing it." Caleb turned back to the piano and pressed one key, then another. The vibrations were stronger than the keyboard, deeper, more resonant. The entire piano sang with each note, the wood amplifying the sound in ways the electronic keyboard couldn't match. "Try playing something," Grace signed. Caleb sat down at the bench, positioned his hands, and began to play one of the pieces he'd been working on. The difference was immediate and dramatic. The piano responded to his touch in ways the keyboard hadn't, the vibrations traveling through the bench, through the floor, filling the small apartment with sound. Caleb's face transformed. His eyes closed, his body swayed slightly, completely absorbed in the sensation. When he finished, he opened his eyes, and there were tears on his cheeks. "That was amazing," he signed. "I felt it everywhere. It was like the music was inside me." Grace was crying too. That's exactly what Joshua said. The first time he played a real piano. Those exact words. From that day forward, Caleb practiced on Joshua's piano for hours every day. His technical skill improved rapidly, but more than that, his emotional expression deepened. He was connecting with the music on a profound level, understanding it not as an intellectual exercise, but as a direct channel to emotion and meaning. In April, something remarkable happened. Richard came home from work to find Caleb and Grace in the living room with two other people, a woman in her 30s with a professional camera and a teenage girl who was also deaf. Grace stood and signed to Richard, explaining, "This is Sarah Chen, a documentary filmmaker, and this is her daughter Mia. Mia is deaf and has been learning music through my method for 6 months. Sarah wants to make a short film about vibration-based music therapy. I thought Caleb might want to meet another student." Richard looked at Caleb, who was signing animatedly with Mia. The two children were comparing notes about their experiences, their hands flying in excited conversation. "You're expanding the program?" Richard asked Grace. "Word got out," Grace said. "After I started posting videos of Caleb playing, other parents of deaf children started contacting me. I have 5 students now, teaching them in my apartment in the evenings." Richard felt a surge of emotion. "Grace, that's incredible. You're doing exactly what Joshua wanted, creating a school teaching his method." Grace smiled. "It's what he would have wanted. And honestly, it's what's keeping me going. These children, seeing them discover music the way Caleb has, the way Joshua did. It's everything." Sarah Chen approached Richard, her hand extended. "Mr. Harrison, your son is remarkable. The way he plays, the emotional depth. Grace tells me he's been learning for only 4 months." "That's right. I'd like to feature him in my documentary with your permission. His story, his journey, I think it could help change how people think about deafness and music and what's possible." Richard looked at Caleb, still deep in conversation with Mia. His son had come so far in such a short time, from isolated and lonely to engaged and expressive, from silent to eloquent in the language of music. "Let me talk to Caleb," Richard said. "If he's comfortable with it, then yes." That evening, after Grace and the others had left, Richard sat with Caleb and explained about the documentary. "How do you feel about it?" Richard signed. "Being on camera, having people see you play?" Caleb thought about this seriously. Then he signed, "Will. It'd help other kids like me. That's what Sarah hopes. She thinks your story could inspire parents of deaf children. Show them what's possible. Caleb nodded decisively. Then I want to do it. If it helps even one kid feel less alone like I used to feel, then it's worth it. Richard pulled his son close. When did you get so wise? Caleb grinned. I had good teachers, you and Grace. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah filmed Caleb's lessons, his practice sessions, his compositions. She interviewed Grace about Joshua and the method he'd developed. She captured Caleb playing the old upright piano, his face serene, his hands confident on the keys. The day she finished filming, Sarah showed them a rough cut of the documentary. It was only 15 minutes long, but those 15 minutes captured something profound. The film opened with Caleb's story, his early isolation, the years of failed treatments. Then Grace appeared, talking about Joshua, explaining the science behind vibration-based music perception. The middle section showed Caleb learning, struggling, breaking through. And the final sequence was Caleb at the piano, playing one of his own compositions, a piece he called Finding My Voice. As Richard watched his son on screen completely absorbed in the act of creation, he realized something. Caleb wasn't disabled. He wasn't limited. He was simply experiencing the world differently, and that different experience was giving him a unique perspective, a unique voice. The documentary ended with Caleb signing directly to the camera. Music isn't just sound, it's feeling, it's connection, it's joy, and everyone deserves to experience it no matter how they hear or don't hear. Grace and Joshua taught me that, and now I want to teach others. When the film ended, Grace was sobbing. Joshua would be so proud, she kept saying. So proud. Sarah uploaded the documentary to YouTube in early May. Within a week, it had been viewed 50,000 times. Within 2 weeks, 500,000. People were sharing it, commenting, many of them in tears. Richard started getting emails. Parents of deaf children from around the country, around the world, asking about the method, asking if Grace could teach their children, asking for hope. Grace's small program of 5 students exploded into a waiting list of hundreds. One evening in late May, as Caleb practiced, and Grace sat beside Richard on the worn couch in their small apartment, she turned to him. I need to make this official, she said. A real program, maybe a nonprofit, the Joshua Thompson Center for Vibration-Based Music Therapy. We could train other teachers in the method, reach more children, make this sustainable. That's an amazing idea, Richard said. But it takes money to start a nonprofit. Infrastructure, legal fees, all of it. Grace nodded. I know. I've been trying to figure out how to fund it. She looked at him. Richard, you know construction, you know project management, you know how to build things from the ground up. Would you help me? Would you partner with me on this? Richard felt something ignite in his chest. A purpose, a mission, something worth building that wasn't about money or ego, but about actually helping people. Yes, he said, without hesitation. Absolutely, yes. They shook hands, formally sealing the partnership. Then they laughed at the formality of it, given that they'd become family months ago. From the piano, Caleb called out by waving his hand to get their attention. He signed, What are you two planning? Grace signed back. We're going to change the world. Want to help? Caleb's response was a grin that could have lit up the entire building. Always he signed, Let's change the world. June brought warmth to New York City, and an invitation that would change everything. The email came from Dr. Helena Morrison, the director of the New York Institute for Deaf Education, one of the most prestigious institutions of its kind in the country. She had seen Sarah's documentary. She wanted Caleb to perform at the Institute's annual gala, a fundraising event that attracted donors, educators, and advocates from across the nation. Over 500 people would attend. "It's an incredible opportunity," Grace said, showing Richard the email. "But it's also a lot of pressure." Caleb would be performing for an audience of hearing people and deaf people educators, who might be skeptical donors who hold the purse strings for deaf education programs nationwide. Richard felt the weight of it. "What do you think? Is he ready?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "Technically, yes. He's ready. Emotionally, that's up to him. This isn't just about playing notes correctly. It's about standing in front of hundreds of people and being vulnerable, being seen. That's hard for anyone, especially a child who spent most of his life feeling invisible." They talked to Caleb that evening. Grace explained the invitation, what it would mean, what would be expected of him. Caleb listened carefully, processing. Then he signed, "Will there be other deaf kids there?" Grace nodded. "Yes. Students from the Institute. Teachers, parents. And if I play well, will it help them? That's the hope. It would show them what's possible. Show them that deaf children can experience music in profound ways." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Richard resisted the urge to push, letting his son work through his thoughts. Finally, Caleb signed, "I'm scared. What if I mess up? What if I freeze?" Grace's response was gentle but firm. "Then you mess up. Then you freeze. And then you start again. That's what performers do. But Caleb, I've watched you play every day for 5 months. You won't mess up. You know this. Music is part of you now." Caleb looked at his father. "What do you think, Dad?" Richard signed carefully. "I think this is scary. I think it's a lot of pressure. And I think you can do it. But more importantly, I'll be proud of you whether you do it or not. Your worth isn't about performing for strangers. It's about who you are." Caleb smiled, reassured. "Okay," he signed. "I'll do it. For Joshua. And for all the kids who think they can't." The gala was scheduled for June 15th, just 3 weeks away. Grace and Caleb went into intensive preparation mode. They chose the pieces he would perform, 2 classical selections that would showcase his technical skill, and one of his own compositions, the piece he'd written for Grace. The whole performance would be about 12 minutes. But Grace knew the technical preparation was only half the battle. She also worked with Caleb on performance anxiety, on how to center himself, on how to connect with an audience, even when you can't hear their reactions. When you're on stage, she signed, you're not performing for them. You're sharing with them. You're inviting them into your experience. That's the difference between playing notes and making music. Richard watched these preparation sessions with awe. Grace was teaching Caleb not just to be a musician, but to be an artist, someone who understood that performance was about communication, about connection. The night before the gala, none of them could sleep. Richard lay in bed, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. His business collapse, which had seemed like the end of everything, but which had actually freed him to be present for his son in a way he never had been before. Grace walking through their door with her secret and her grief and her gift. Caleb's determination, his willingness to work hard, to be vulnerable, to try something that everyone had said was impossible. Tomorrow night, his son would stand on a stage and prove to the world that deaf children could create music just as beautiful as anyone else's. Richard got up around 2 a.m. and found Caleb awake too, sitting by the window, looking out at the city lights. "Can't sleep," Richard signed. "Too nervous," Caleb admitted. "Want to talk about it?" Caleb turned from the window. "Dad, what if they don't understand? What if hearing people listen to me play and think it's not real music because I can't hear it?" Richard sat down beside his son. Then they'll be wrong. Music isn't defined by how you perceive it. It's defined by what you put into it, by the emotion and meaning you create. You make real music, Caleb, as real as any musician who's ever lived. But what if Richard gently interrupted him? What if you're amazing? What if you change minds and touch hearts and show everyone that there's no one right way to experience beauty? That's what's going to happen tomorrow. I know it. Caleb leaned against his father. I'm glad you'll be there. Richard wrapped his arm around his son. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. I'm your dad, and you're my hero. Always have been. The day of the gala arrived with brilliant sunshine and temperatures in the 80s. Grace arrived at their apartment early to help Caleb get ready. She'd brought him a suit, simple and elegant, appropriate for the formal event. As she helped him with his tie, her hands were shaking slightly. Nervous Richard asked her. Terrified, Grace admitted. This is everything Joshua worked for, everything he dreamed of. And tonight Caleb gets to show the world what Joshua discovered. The pressure feels enormous. He's going to be perfect, Richard said with more confidence than he felt. They arrived at the Institute 2 hours before the gala started. Dr. Morrison met them at the door, a tall woman with kind eyes and graying hair. Caleb, she signed, and spoke simultaneously. I'm so honored you're here. Your story, your gift. It's extraordinary. Thank you for sharing it with us. Caleb signed back shyly. Thank you for inviting me. Dr. Morrison showed them to a small green room where Caleb could warm up and practice. The room had an upright piano, not as nice as Joshua's, but serviceable. Caleb sat down and began to play running through scales to loosen his fingers. Grace watched critically, checking his technique, his positioning. Richard stepped out into the hallway, needing air, needing to move. He walked through the building, seeing classrooms designed for deaf students' technology that helped with communication photos on the walls of successful graduates. This was a good place, Richard realized. A place that understood and celebrated deaf culture. Caleb's performance tonight would be in front of people who already respected deaf individuals, who already knew they were capable of extraordinary things. But vibration-based music therapy was still controversial in the deaf community. Some saw it as unnecessary, arguing that deaf people didn't need music, that they had their own culture and art forms. Others worried it was another attempt to fix deafness, rather than accepting it. Grace had warned Richard about this. Some people won't like what we're doing, she'd said. They'll see it as denying deaf identity. We have to be respectful of that perspective while also maintaining that deaf children deserve access to all forms of expression, including music, if they want it. Richard understood the complexity. This wasn't just about Caleb playing piano. It was about larger questions of disability, identity culture, and what it meant to be deaf in a hearing world. But tonight, he just wanted his son to have his moment, to shine. At 7 o'clock, the gala began. The auditorium filled with guests in formal wear, a mix of hearing and deaf attendees. There were speeches, awards given to educators and advocates, a silent auction with items ranging from artwork to vacation packages. Caleb's performance was scheduled for 8:30, near the end of the program. Richard sat in the front row with Grace. His palms were sweating. His heart was racing. He kept glancing backstage where Caleb waited with Dr. Morrison. Finally, Dr. Morrison took the stage. She spoke and signed simultaneously, her words projected on screens for accessibility. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have something special, a demonstration of something many of you may have seen in a recent documentary. A young man who has learned to experience music not through sound, but through vibration. His teacher, Grace Thompson, developed this method based on her late son Joshua's pioneering work. Grace tensed beside Richard. He reached over and took her hand. "This young man," Dr. Morrison continued, "has been learning music for just 6 months. But what he's about to share with you represents not just technical skill, but deep emotional understanding. Please welcome Caleb Harrison." The audience applauded, the hearing people clapping, the deaf attendees raising their hands and shaking them in the air, the deaf community's form of applause. Caleb walked onto the stage. He looked so small up there, a 10-year-old boy in a suit that was slightly too big for him, walking toward the grand piano that sat center stage under a spotlight. Richard's breath caught. This was it. Caleb sat at the piano bench and positioned his hands over the keys. He took a breath, centering himself the way Grace had taught him. And then he began to play. The first piece was Bach Prelude in C major. Simple but beautiful, each note clear and precise. Caleb played it perfectly, his fingers moving with confidence, born of hours of practice. The audience was completely silent, mesmerized. The second piece was Chopin Nocturne in E-flat major, more complex, more emotional. Caleb's hands moved across the keys with Grace drawing out the melody, creating dynamics, telling a story through music. Richard could see people in the audience leaning forward, captivated. Some were crying. And then Caleb played his own composition, Grace's song. This was different from the classical pieces. This was personal, intimate, a 10-year-old boy pouring his heart out through music he couldn't hear but could feel in every cell of his body. The melody started soft, and sad grief transformed into notes. It built, gradually adding complexity, adding layers, becoming richer. And then it shifted, the sadness transforming into something else. Hope, love, gratitude. The music swelled, filled the auditorium, touched everyone present. Richard looked at Grace. Tears were streaming down her face. She was watching Caleb play this song he'd written for her, this musical portrait of her loss and strength and love. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence, and then the auditorium erupted. The hearing people stood applauding wildly. The deaf attendees raised their hands high, shaking them vigorously. People were crying openly, not bothering to hide their tears. Caleb stood and bowed, looking overwhelmed by the response he couldn't hear, but could feel in the vibration of hundreds of hands clapping in the way the audience had risen to their feet. Dr. Morrison came back on stage. She signed to Caleb, asking him to stay, then addressed the audience. "What you just witnessed," she said, "is not just a performance, it's a revolution. For too long we've accepted that deaf children can't experience music. But Caleb and Grace and Joshua before them have proven that's not true. They've shown us that there are multiple ways to experience sound, multiple ways to create art, multiple ways to express the inexpressible." She turned to Caleb. "Would you be willing to answer some questions from the audience?" Caleb looked nervous, but nodded. The first question came from a deaf woman in her 40s, signing from the audience. "Can you really feel the difference between different notes, or are you just memorizing patterns?" Caleb thought for a moment, then signed his response, which Dr. Morrison voiced for the hearing attendees. "At first, I was memorizing, but now I feel it. Each note has its own personality, its own feeling. C feels grounded and strong. G feels open and bright. When I play, I'm having a conversation with these feelings, arranging them to say what I want to say." Another question this time from a hearing educator. "Do you consider yourself a deaf musician or just a musician who happens to be deaf?" Caleb's response was immediate and clear. "Both. Being deaf is part of who I am. It shapes how I experience music. But I'm also just a musician like any other musician." The music I create is real music, whether people hear it or feel it. A young deaf student, maybe 12 years old, stood and signed a question. I want to learn music too. My parents say it's not possible. What should I tell them? Caleb smiled, and his signed response was passionate. Tell them anything is possible if you want it enough, and you find the right teacher. Tell them that being deaf doesn't mean being silent. We have voices, just different ones. And real music is available to anyone who wants to connect with it. The audience erupted in applause again. After several more questions, Dr. Morrison thanked Caleb and announced a special surprise. The Institute would like to partner with Grace Thompson to establish an official program in vibration-based music therapy. We're committing funding to train teachers in this method and make it available to our students and to deaf children across the country. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. She looked at Richard in shock. Dr. Morrison continued. And we're naming this program the Joshua Thompson Memorial Music Center in honor of the young man whose discovery made all of this possible. Grace broke down completely, sobbing with joy and grief and gratitude all mixed together. On stage, Caleb was crying too. He signed to the audience. Thank you. Thank you for believing that we can do this. Thank you for seeing us. Richard stood with the rest of the audience clapping until his hands hurt, watching his son take bow after bow, watching Grace's dream and Joshua's legacy becoming real in front of their eyes. This was the miracle they'd been building toward. Not just Caleb playing music, but a revolution in how the world understood deafness and possibility and the many ways to experience beauty. As they left the stage and Richard wrapped both Caleb and Grace in a fierce hug, he thought about how far they'd come. From that November morning when Grace had walked through their door to this June evening when she and Caleb were changing the world. Money hadn't saved them. Success hadn't saved them. Love had saved them. Connection had saved them. Hope had saved them. And now they were going to share that salvation with every deaf child who wanted to feel music in their bones and create beauty with their hands. The months following the gala were a whirlwind of activity and change. The documentary went viral after Caleb's performance, garnering millions of views worldwide. Media outlets picked up the story. Good Morning America invited Caleb and Grace for an interview. NPR did a feature piece. Parents from around the globe reached out desperate to learn the method to give their deaf children access to music. The Joshua Thompson Memorial Music Center became official in August, housed in a new wing of the New York Institute for Deaf Education. Grace was named director with Richard serving as operations manager. They hired 3 teachers to train in the method, all of them deaf or hard of hearing, all of them passionate about making music accessible. By September, they had 20 students enrolled and a waiting list of over 300 families. Richard's role expanded beyond just operations management. He was fundraising, building partnerships with other deaf education institutions, helping to scale the program sustainably. It was harder work than running his real estate empire had been, and he earned a fraction of what he used to make. But he woke up every morning excited about what he was building. That had never been true before. One October evening, Richard came home to find Caleb at the piano, as usual, but this time working with another student. A 6-year-old deaf girl named Emma, shy and uncertain, was sitting beside Caleb as he showed her how to feel the vibrations. Grace stood nearby, supervising, but she'd let Caleb take the lead. Richard watched from the doorway as his son, patient and encouraging, placed Emma's small hands on the piano keys. Caleb played a note, and Emma's eyes went wide with surprise and delight. Again, she signed with enthusiastic abandon. Caleb played it again, smiling at her reaction. He signed, "Each note is like a different color. This one feels like blue to me. What does it feel like to you, Emma? thought seriously about this, her small face scrunched in concentration. Like water, she signed finally, like being in a pool. Caleb's face lit up. That's perfect. Let's find the other colors together. Richard felt his throat tighten with pride. His son wasn't just learning music anymore. He was teaching it, sharing the gift Grace had given him, carrying forward Joshua's legacy. Later that night, after Emma and her parents had left after Grace had gone home, Richard sat with Caleb at dinner. You were amazing with Emma today, Richard signed. A natural teacher. Caleb shrugged modestly. I remember what it felt like to be scared, to think music was impossible. I just wanted her to know it's not. You're changing lives, Richard signed. You know that, right, Emma, and all the other kids you're working with? You're showing them what they're capable of. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he signed Dad. I've been thinking about something. What's that? Before, when we lived in the big apartment and you were always working, I felt invisible. Like I wasn't important enough for you to see me. He paused, then continued. But now, even though we have less money and a smaller apartment and everything changed, I feel seen. I feel like you know who I am. Richard's vision blurred with tears. I'm so sorry it took me so long. Sorry I had to lose everything to figure out what mattered. Caleb shook his head. Don't be sorry. Grace says sometimes we need to lose things to find better things. You lost your business, but you found yourself. And I found you. Richard pulled his son into a hug, holding him tightly. I love you, he said aloud, knowing Caleb couldn't hear the words, but hoping he could feel them in the embrace. In November, a year after Grace had first walked through their door, the family gathered to celebrate. Grace's sister Patricia hosted Thanksgiving at her house in Queens, and they invited everyone who had become part of their extended family. Sarah Chen, the documentary filmmaker, and her daughter Mia. Dr. Morrison from the Institute. The 3 teachers from the Joshua Thompson Center. Emma and her parents. A dozen others whose lives had been touched by the program. Before dinner, Grace stood to say a few words. She signed as she spoke, making sure everyone could follow. A year ago, I was broken. I'd lost my son, lost my purpose, lost my hope. But then I met Richard and Caleb, and they gave me a reason to keep going. They let me honor Joshua's memory by sharing his gift. She looked around the room. Now look at what we've built together. A program that's helping children experience music, a community that believes in possibility, a family chosen and beloved. Grace's voice broke slightly. Joshua used to say that music was about connection, connecting to something larger than ourselves, connecting to each other, connecting to the divine spark in every human soul. And that's what we have here. Connection, love, hope. She raised her glass. To Joshua, who started all this. To Caleb, who's carrying it forward. And to all of us for finding each other when we needed it most. Everyone toasted, tears flowing freely around the table. After dinner, as the adults talked and laughed, Caleb and Mia and Emma gathered around the piano in Patricia's living room. Caleb was teaching them a new song, their hands moving over the keys together, creating music that some of them could hear and all of them could feel. Richard stood in the doorway, watching Grace beside him. Thank you, Richard said quietly. For everything. For seeing Caleb when no one else did. For teaching him. For giving him a voice. Grace shook her head. Caleb always had a voice. I just helped him find a way to share it. She paused, then added, and thank you for letting me. For trusting me with your son. For becoming family. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children make music together. What Joshua started, Grace said finally, is going to outlive all of us. These children we're teaching, they're going to teach others. The method will spread, and eventually deaf children everywhere will know that music is theirs too if they want it. That's a beautiful legacy, Richard said. It is. And you know what the most beautiful part is? Grace smiled. Joshua never wanted fame or recognition. He just wanted deaf kids to feel less alone. He wanted them to know they weren't broken, weren't missing something essential. They were complete exactly as they were, and music was just one more way they could express that completeness. He'd be proud of you, Richard said. Of everything you've done. He'd be proud of Caleb, Grace corrected. That boy is extraordinary, not because he learned it to play music, but because of who he is. Kind, determined, generous. You raised an amazing human, Richard. Richard felt emotion welling up again. These days he cried easily, and he'd stopped being embarrassed about it. I didn't do it alone, he said. You were there for the important part, the part where he needed someone who understood. From the piano, Caleb called out with a wave, beckoning them over. When they approached, he signed, Grace, can you play Joshua's favorite song? The one from the video you showed me? Grace nodded, sitting at the piano. Her hands moved over the keys, playing a melody Richard had heard before, something Caleb had incorporated into one of his own compositions. As Grace played, Caleb placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the music through her body, through the connection between them. And Richard Harrison, who had once measured success in dollars and buildings and power, looked around this room full of people who loved each other, who had found each other in the wreckage of loss and disappointment, and he understood finally what true wealth looked like. It looked like this. Family gathered around a piano, children laughing, music filling the spaces between words. It looked like Grace. 5 years later, Carnegie Hall in Manhattan was sold out, all 800 seats, filled with people who had come to witness something unprecedented. Backstage, 15-year-old Caleb Harrison adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. He was taller now, his child's face giving way to the features of the young man he was becoming. But his eyes still held that same determined kindness they'd always had. Grace stood beside him, her hair grayer now, the lines around her eyes deeper. Nervous, she signed. Always before a performance, Caleb signed back with a smile, but excited too. Richard joined them wearing a suit that was off the rack, but well-tailored. He'd never returned to his former wealth, and he didn't want to. The work he did now, expanding the Joshua Thompson Centers to 12 cities across the United States, was far more valuable than any real estate deal he'd ever closed. The stage manager approached and signed 5 minutes. Caleb nodded. He looked at Grace and his father, these two people who had saved him, and who he had saved in return. Whatever happens out there, he signed, thank you, for believing in me, for teaching me, for showing me who I could become. You did that yourself, Grace signed. We just held up the mirror. The stage manager waved, indicating it was time. Caleb walked to the wings and looked out at the stage. At the center was a Steinway grand piano, the finest instrument money could rent, positioned under a spotlight that would illuminate him completely. In the audience were people who had been on this journey with him. His teachers from school, students from the Joshua Thompson Centers, including Emma, now 11, and teaching younger children herself. Sarah Chen, whose documentary had started everything. Dr. Morrison, Patricia, Mia. And in the front row seats of honor sat Grace and Richard, holding hands, watching their son prepare to do something extraordinary. The lights dimmed. The audience quieted. An announcer's voice filled the hall, also shown on screens for deaf attendees. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are privileged to witness a historic performance. Caleb Harrison, who learned to experience music through vibration alone, will be the first profoundly deaf musician to perform a full solo recital at Carnegie Hall. His program tonight includes works by Bach, Chopin, and several of his own compositions. Please welcome Caleb Harrison. Caleb walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, hands clapping, and raised hands shaking. He bowed, then sat at the piano. He placed his hands on the keys, closed his eyes, and began to play. The music that filled Carnegie Hall that night was nothing short of miraculous. Technical precision combined with emotional depth, every note imbued with meaning, every phrase telling a story. Caleb played the classical pieces with respect for the composers, while adding his own interpretive voice. He played his own compositions with raw honesty, pouring his journey, his struggles, his triumphs into every measure. And the final piece, the one he'd written specifically for this night, was dedicated to 3 people. This is for my mother, Sarah, who I never got to hear, but who I carry in my heart. For Joshua, who discovered that music belongs to everyone, and who gave me the key to unlock it. And for Grace, who loved me enough to share her greatest treasure, her son's gift. The piece was called The Language of Grace, and it captured everything loss and hope, grief and joy, endings and beginnings. It was 15 minutes of pure emotional truth, translated into vibrations and harmonies and melodies that touched every person in that hall. When the final note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence, and then Carnegie Hall exploded with applause that lasted for 10 minutes. Standing ovation, people crying, everyone on their feet, celebrating not just a performance, but a revolution in understanding. Caleb took bow after bow, overwhelmed by the response. And then he did something unexpected. He signed to the audience, gesturing for Grace to join him on stage. Grace, shocked, shook her head. But the audience had seen, and they began chanting her name, signing it, demanding she come up. Finally, Grace stood and walked onto the stage. Caleb embraced her, then signed for everyone to see. None of this would exist without Grace Thompson and her son, Joshua. They proved that deafness isn't silence. It's just a different way of listening. And music isn't just sound. It's vibration, emotion, connection. It belongs to everyone. He turned to Grace. Thank you for teaching me to hear with my heart. Grace was crying too hard to sign back. She just held Caleb tightly while the audience continued their thunderous appreciation. Later at the reception, Richard stood with Grace, watching Caleb surrounded by admirers, journalists, other musicians who wanted to understand his technique. He's going to change the world, Richard said. He already has, Grace corrected. There are now 30 Joshua Thompson centers in 8 countries, hundreds of deaf children learning music. The method is being taught in schools. Everything Joshua dreamed of, it's happening. Because of you. Because of all of us. Because we believed that impossible just meant no one had figured out how yet. Richard raised his glass. To Joshua, who started the revolution. Grace clinked her glass against his. To Caleb, who's leading it forward. And to you, Richard added. The bridge between them, the grace that made all of this possible. As the reception continued around them, as Caleb laughed with new friends and planned new compositions, as the future spread out before them full of possibility, Grace thought about the day she'd walked into Richard Harrison's penthouse, broken and grieving and desperate to find meaning in her loss. She'd gone there thinking she would help them, but they had saved her just as much as she'd saved them. That was the real miracle Grace realized. Not that a deaf boy learned to play music. That was extraordinary, yes, but it was just the visible part of something deeper. The real miracle was that broken people had found each other and made each other whole. That loss had been transformed into purpose. That grief had become grace. And that grace, in turn, had become a gift to the world. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or buildings or possessions. It's measured in the connections we forge, the lives we touch, the love we give and receive. Caleb Harrison couldn't hear music the way most people do, but he learned to feel it in ways more profound than sound alone could ever convey. His journey taught the world that disability is often just a different way of experiencing life, and that difference, rather than being a limitation, can be a source of extraordinary beauty and insight. Grace Thompson lost her son, but found a way to keep his dream alive, to transform her grief into a gift that would help countless children experience the joy of music. Richard Harrison lost his empire, but found his soul discovering that being present for his son was worth more than any business success. Together, they proved that hope can be found even in the darkest times, that impossible just means no one has figured it out yet, and that the most meaningful things in life can't be bought or sold. They proved that grace in all its meanings is what saves us.